Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.4, the 22nd of April. As dawn broke on the 22nd of April, Marshal Zhukov was frustrated by the advance of his armies, because in his original plan for the assault on Berlin, he had penciled in the 22nd of April as the day he would capture the Nazi capital. But in actual fact, due to the unexpectedly stubborn defence shown by the Germans along the Zeelower Heights, his first Belarusian front had only made it to the outskirts of Berlin on the 20th of April and had only started assaulting the city with ground forces on the 21st of April. Zhukov was clearly way behind schedule, and even now, the bulk of his forces had only just succeeded in penetrating the northern and eastern districts of the city. He was nowhere near the central government district, and worse still, the fight to reach the centre of the city and the prized Reichstag would only get harder and bloodier from here on out. One thing that was holding back Zhukov's armies from advancing quickly was the network of rivers, swamps and streams which dotted the landscape throughout Berlin. But luckily for Zhukov, however, his engineering companies had by now honed their skills in bridging and fording rivers. And even when his 1st Guards tank army reached the banks of the River Spree in the eastern district of Köpenick, they weren't held up for long, as engineers immediately set to work building a pontoon bridge, enabling the Soviet armoured spearhead to continue its advance into Berlin. Whilst Zhukov's forces solidified their grip on the northeastern and eastern parts of Berlin, he also launched his forces on a flanking attack around the north of Berlin in order to encircle the city. Stalin had ordered that Berlin be encircled, not just for the military sense of cutting off the city garrison from resupply and reinforcements, or to prevent the escape of the Berlin garrison from the city. Stalin also wanted Berlin encircled for political reasons, to ensure that the honour of capturing the Nazi capital was claimed solely by the Soviet Union. Despite the Allied assurances that US forces would not advance on Berlin, Stalin, ever the paranoid psychopath, was convinced that the Americans might renege on their promises and launch their own attack towards the city. Stalin was convinced that the Americans were lying. After all, that's what he would do. In reality, the Americans were happy to let the Russians do the fighting and the dying to capture Berlin. And as the Yalta Agreement confirmed that the US would receive a slice of Berlin after the war ended anyway, it seemed unnecessary to waste American lives in a fight for the city. But despite the lack of evidence that the Americans were going to assault Berlin, Stalin was still fixated on encircling the city just in case. So he repeatedly pushed Zhukov and Konev to link up their forces in an encirclement of Berlin ASAP. With this objective in mind, Zhukov ordered his 2nd Guards tank armies, 1st Mechanized Corps and 12th Guards Tank Corps to embark on a wide flanking manoeuvre through the northern districts of Berlin, and they started advancing into the area of Siemensstadt, heading for the central western district of Charlottenburg. And in addition, Zhukov ordered the 47th Army to advance as quickly as possible around the northern flank of Berlin as well. Their mission was to advance through the town of Oranienburg and then proceed west to fully encircle the northern half of the city. Meanwhile, to the southeast of the city, General Zhukov's 8th Guards Army continued forcing General Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps back deeper into Berlin, with Soviet tanks reaching the localities of Friedrichshagen and Wendenschloss, which were either side of the large Müggelsee Lake. The Soviet advance in the southeast of the city was relentless, and because the German resistance was weak and sporadic, entire Soviet rifle regiments were managing to cross multiple rivers within a single day, with the Spree and Dahme rivers been crossed on the 22nd of April, and by the end of the day, the Soviet forces had taken Grunau and Falkenberg. The German forces in the southeast of the city were in complete disarray, with the only force able to put up some meaningful resistance being the 56th Panzer Corps. However, the Panzer Corps commander, General Weidling, didn't just have the Russians to worry about, for he had learned of the execution orders which had been issued for him by Hitler and General Busse of the Ninth Army. As you can imagine, these execution orders put General Weidling in a tricky position, because on the one hand, Hitler was threatening to have him shot if he didn't pull his forces back into Berlin for the defense of the city, whilst on the other hand, General Busse was likewise threatening him with execution if he didn't try to break his forces out of Berlin in order to link up with the remainder of the Ninth Army in the Spreewald area. General Weidling knew that to go into the city would spell doom for his 56th Panzer Corps. But the thought of being encircled in the Haube area was also no picnic either. Faced with this impossible decision, Weidling decided to hold his position for now and engage whatever Soviet forces came his way. Whilst General Weidling held his ground in the southeast of the city, the Soviets continued their advance elsewhere, with the 5th Shock Army pushing further into the eastern districts, whilst the 3rd Shock Army advanced through the northern districts in a drive towards the centre. Now, Marshal Zhukov had identified the 3rd and 5th Shock Armies as key elements of his forces which would assault the centre of Berlin. So on the evening of the 22nd of April, Zhukov ordered both armies to consolidate their positions and resupply their frontline troops for the inevitable hard street fighting which lay ahead of them over the next few days. Nevertheless, whilst they eased their advance momentarily in the evening, their artillery continued to pound the city. The constant pummeling from Soviet artillery fire further worsened the conditions for the people of Berlin, with the trappings of daily life now beginning to falter. Newspapers started shutting down, and the city's telegram office, which had proudly operated for 100 years without interruption, was forced to close. The last message it received was from Tokyo, which read, "Good luck to you all." All transportation within the city came to a grinding halt as streets became impassable and petrol supplies for cars dried up, whilst the last plane to leave Berlin flew out of Tempelhof Airport, carrying 9 passengers on a flight bound for Stockholm. By now, law and order had started to break down in Berlin, as the city's policemen were forced to fight in Wehrmacht or Volkssturm units. This meant that the desperate people of Berlin had a free hand to loot any remaining shops or storage spaces they could find, with goods trains sitting in train yards broken into in an effort to find anything which could keep the people alive in their air raid shelters. But as chaotic and hopeless as it felt to the people of Berlin, things were about to get much, much worse. So up until now, Berlin has only been under siege from one front of the Red Army. But very soon, a second front of the Red Army is about to show up. Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, with the 3rd Guards Tank Army in the lead, continued their lightning thrust towards southern Berlin on the 22nd of April. And just as with the advance of the Red Army to the north and east of the city, Marshal Konev's advance to the south of the city was also helped by the pretty pathetic defences the Germans had built. Ragtag Volkssturm and Luftwaffe units were crushed with ease, and the obstacles hastily placed on the major roads leading into the south of Berlin were swept aside in minutes. The quality of the troops defending the southern approaches to Berlin was undoubtedly poor, but their failure to hold the line wasn't so much a reflection of their inexperience but rather a result of the specific tactics which the advancing Soviets were employing, as a key goal for the Red Army was not to get bogged down in trench fighting outside of the city. Therefore, the first Ukrainian Front forces approaching southern Berlin held back their infantry and instead sent in their tanks. As the tanks approached the outer defense ring, they bypassed any strong defensive points, and instead they targeted the weakest points in the line and ploughed straight through, blasting their way through whatever German troops stood in their way. And whilst the Soviet tanks ploughed on through the German lines, the remaining command bunkers and heavily defended positions were pummeled into oblivion by Soviet dive bombers and heavy guns. Such was the success of this approach, the Russian tanks were quickly through the German outer defense ring. And by the evening, the lead elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army managed to reach the Teltow Canal. But as fast as this advance had been, the concrete banks of the Teltow Canal represented a formidable barrier to the Soviet tanks. And the warehouses positioned on the northern side of the canal had been occupied by numerous Volkssturm detachments armed with Panzerfausts and heavy machine guns. Such was the difficulty in identifying routes across the canal and the strength of the German forces assigned to defend it. The 3rd Guards Tank Army was given an entire day to prepare for an assault over the canal. This meant a canal crossing would not be attempted until the 24th of April. And this delay gave time for the full weight of the 3rd Guards Tank Army to arrive at the canal, as the main bulk of infantry were finding their progress into southern Berlin hampered by the exodus of refugees escaping the city. To ensure the assault on the Teltow Canal was a success, Konev assigned entire rifle divisions the task of seizing bridgeheads across the canal. And as a sign of how much firepower was going to be needed, the Russians brought up nearly 3,000 guns and heavy mortars for the assault, leading to a concentration of 650 pieces per kilometre. Whilst Konev assembled his forces on the southern bank of the Teltow Canal, he ordered elements from the right flank of his 3rd Guards Tank Army to push further into the area of Bukow in South Neukölln, in order to make contact with Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front forces coming from the east. Konev was immensely proud of his forces and how they had reached southern Berlin before Zhukov had. And the fact that those forces had reached southern Berlin by the 22nd of April is impressive, given the fact that when Operation Berlin started, Konev's forces had a much greater distance to traverse than Zhukov's forces. But whilst the 22nd of April represented another day of Soviet advances, the Germans, meanwhile, were distracted by Hitler's fixation on the expected counterattack from Army Detachment Steiner, and incessant calls were made all morning inquiring as to whether Steiner had already launched his counterattack on the 1st Belarusian Front forces attacking Berlin from the north and east. Such was the desperation for news that Hitler demanded Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Koller send up Luftwaffe planes into the sky in an attempt to spot whether Steiner's forces were on the move. By the afternoon situation conference, however, it had become abundantly clear that Steiner had not been able to assemble anything close to an effective fighting force, nor was any such force marching towards Berlin. The truth was that most of the units which had been promised to Steiner had failed to appear, and when Zhukov's northern flank, led by the 47th Army, launched their efforts to encircle Berlin from the north, Steiner's headquarters near Oranienburg had to be evacuated. Suddenly, rather than launching a counterattack on Zhukov's forces, Steiner was instead preoccupied with defending the town of Oranienburg. So obviously, Steiner had not made any movement towards Berlin. The news hit Hitler harder than any Soviet artillery shell ever could, and it seems this bombshell finally broke the spell, or delirium, which had sustained Hitler's belief in victory for so long. Upon hearing of Steiner's non-existent counterattack, Hitler flew into one of his most crazed and violent rages of the war, and he descended into a ranting and raving fit of madness, accusing the SS, the army, and everyone under the sun of betraying him. Hitler even acknowledged for the first time that the war was lost. Eventually, Hitler ran out of steam, and he collapsed into an armchair, weeping uncontrollably. He could not be coaxed from his despair, and he announced to all present that because he was too weak to fight, he would simply shoot himself rather than fall into enemy hands. Krebs, Jodl, everyone was shocked, and they once again pleaded with Hitler, begging him to leave the city and escape to Berchtesgaden whilst he still could. But Hitler, having set his mind upon the nature of his demise, could not be shaken from his decision. Hitler said that anyone who wanted to leave Berlin could, but that he was staying in the capital until the end. Krebs fetched for Goebbels, hoping that he could speak some sense to Hitler, but this was hopeful thinking at best, because Goebbels was as equally deranged and mad as Hitler was. So after talking with Hitler for some hours, Goebbels re-emerged, not to announce that he had successfully convinced Hitler to leave, but rather to announce that he was also staying in Berlin to the end. In a display of undying loyalty to his beloved Führer, Goebbels then moved his wife and children into the bunker as well. Fantastic. This show of loyalty from Goebbels restored Hitler's mood somewhat, and his mood was improved even further by a new desperate counterattack plan cooked up by Jodl. This plan, Jodl explained, centered on General Wenck's 12th Army, which was stationed along the River Elbe, guarding against any potential American assault across the river towards Berlin. Jodl gambled that the Americans would not be launching an assault on Berlin, thus Wenck's 12th Army could disengage from their positions, head back east, link up with the German 9th Army, and launch a blistering counterattack on the Soviet forces assaulting Berlin. To say this plan was far-fetched would be an understatement, but it rallied Hitler's spirits, and he seized upon the plan as the only way to save Berlin and his skin from the Russians. Field Marshal Keitel was ordered by Hitler to coordinate the actions of the 12th and 9th Armies, and Keitel left the Führerbunker on the evening of the 22nd to travel to Wenck's headquarters along the River Elbe, to deliver his orders in person.